Hello everyone, this is A&W from the Terasology art team, and I'm here with the second tutorial in the series on creating block shapes for Terasology in Blender. My first one dealt with getting set up to create block shapes and just getting prepared for that. So I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. If you want to check that out, you can just check the first tutorial in this series. Otherwise, I'm going to just be going through the very basics of what you need to know to be able to create a block shape in Blender for Terasology, and then while I'm doing it, I'll just create a very simple block shape to demonstrate and put it into Terasology and just see how it works. So, before we really get started, I just wanted to mention that on the GitHub repository for Terasology, they actually have a wiki, and down on the wiki under architecture, they have a page here for block shapes in Blender. So if reading is more your thing, you might want to read through this. It does cover most of the basic stuff that you have to know to be able to create block shapes. So if you just read this and really follow it, you can create block shapes just fine. A quick note, my first video tutorial basically covered the installing Terasology block shape add-on section here. So that's what my first tutorial basically covered, and if you saw that, that'll be pretty familiar. This tutorial is basically going to cover the fundamentals of what you need to know to create a block shape in Blender. So you might want to just check this out. It has a bit of info, and otherwise we're just going to get started here. First thing is just we're going to open up Blender and check it out real fast. If you've never used Blender, it can look pretty intimidating, a lot of buttons and stuff. Don't panic though. It's you really just hardly need to use any of it to create simple block shapes for Terasology. So yeah. Otherwise, also if you've never used it before, it may be tricky getting around. You might want to check out a few tutorials on the internet or something. There are many tutorials on just getting the very basics started with Blender. So I'm not going to really cover it. I am going to mention that the pretty basic things that are slightly different in Blender than most applications is that select is right click. So as you can see, we've got three objects here in the default setup. So selecting one is a right click instead of a left mouse button, which moves around that funky little thing in the viewport there, which is called the 3D cursor. Otherwise, you can also move around the viewport by using your middle mouse button. That is the most important thing to use when you're moving around the 3D viewport. You can zoom in and out and rotate. Also, you can pan around by holding Shift on the keyboard. But really, if you can get the hang of just moving around the viewport like this and such, you're basically mostly on your way to be able to create a simple block shape right here in Blender. The only other things that you really need to know are the ones to keep in mind specifically for creating block shapes for Terasology. So we're going to get started on that real quick. I'll run through the specific things that are that you need to know, which again are covered on the wiki page. But I'm just going to run through them right now and tell you what those are so that you can be aware of them and make a successful block shape. That actually looks like what you need to looks like what you expect in Terasology. So I'm just going to select these two other default objects and delete those and just leave the default cube here in the middle of the scene. Which, by the way, if your rotating gets off a little bit, the other handy thing to know for this even is that selecting an object and hitting numpad period will focus your view on the object. So, there we go, we're ready. Probably, well, the first thing to remember is that, this is Terasology specific, the first thing to remember is that the Terasology block shape add-on exports, exports blocks, okay, the Terasology block shape add-on, this default cube is twice as big as the Terasology cube. So the Terasology block shape add-on would export this as a 2x2 by 2 stack of blocks in Terasology. So it would be much larger than you expect. So to just fix that, we're going to scale it down. Now the easiest way to do this and not mess anything up is just go into edit mode, which right now we're in object mode. Kind of gives us the whole multiple variety of objects selecting and no real editing or anything. Edit mode, for a mesh at least, takes us into where we can just influence its vertices and such and change its shape. So just go into edit mode, we're going to select everything, which use a handy key A on your keyboard, so very useful for just selecting or deselecting thing. Tap it twice if you've got something selected to select everything. And then we're just going to scale this down half so that it would export correctly. So scale S 0.5. There. That is actually the correct size for a Terasology block. This is exactly one Terasology block size. So this would export the correct size. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, is the default cube in Blender is twice as big as the default cube in Terasology. The second thing to keep in mind here is that the coordinate system is slightly different. You can see the axes here in the middle, the blue z-axis, green y-axis, and the red x-axis. Now, in Blender, it's slightly different from what Terasology expects, so I'm just going to show that to you right now. Quick note, numpad on your keyboard has a lot of useful viewport related things. One of them is just quick hot keys for manipulating from where you're looking at things from. So key 1 is front view in Blender. So in front view, you can check your view up here. In front view, it's basically the same as in Terasology, meaning you're looking at this block from the front in Blender, you'd be looking at it from the front in Terasology. But the left and right are actually flipped here in Blender from what Terasology expects. So when you're modeling in Blender, remember that the right side here in Blender is actually the left side in Terasology, and vice versa. So that's sort of tricky, but luckily it's the only thing that you have to really keep in mind. And the wiki page actually explains this down here, right here. But yeah, that's basically what it's just saying, is the left side in Blender would be the right in Terasology and vice versa. That's the second thing that you need to keep in mind. The third thing that you need to do to be able to create a block shape is something I'll just demonstrate after making a quick block shape here. So to just make a really simple block shape, I'm going to make a pyramid shape, and it's very simple, but it demonstrates several things. First, just go into edit mode for our cube. This allows us to mess with its shape. And we're going to deselect everything with A and select the top 4 vertices on our cube. Now the easiest way to just make this into a pyramid is to hit Alt-M, and this is the merge function. Basically, if you've got multiple verts selected, you can collapse them into one based on these functions here. And we're just going to do at center. And that gives us, collapses them into one vert in the middle, which happens to give us our very nice pyramid shape. So yes, very simple, but it suffices. I don't actually think there's a pyramid shape in Terasology right now, so yeah, that's something. Okay, we've just modeled our shape. You could basically be finished right here, but really the third important thing to remember when making a block shape for Terasology is that the best block shape has to be split into pieces that are respective to the certain sides they're on in relation to a default cube. So what I mean with that cryptic statement is that, for instance, this pyramid here's base is exactly the size of a, let's say the top of a Terasology cube in Terasology. So, and it not only that, but it's also, if we go into the right view here, or front view for that matter, not only that, it's, if we place this block, it would be sitting exactly on top of another one. So we've got this, the bottom of our pyramid here would basically be in the exact same place as the top of a block it was sitting on, or on the side of it, or if it rotates, if you can get a block that rotates, it would be sitting on the side of a block or something. So that's why the Terasology block shapes need to be split apart, so that when you've got those sides that are exactly against another block shape's side, it just knows how to handle that and such. So we're going to go into edit mode again, which I just used the hotkey for that, which is tab, and select face mode here. Down here, these little 3 buttons, you can select face select mode. That gives us access to whole faces. We're going to select the bottom face and just separate it out like I was trying to explain. Separate selection. That makes a separate selection that we can do stuff with. Now, if we say had other faces against what would be the sides of a cube, if this was inside a default cube in Terasology, and you had any faces that were perfectly up against a side, then you would want to split that out and name it the direction's face it was up against. So what I mean is we just separated out the bottom of our pyramid, which would be, if this was contained within a Terasology block, which would be sitting on the bottom. So we're just going to name it bottom. Anything that isn't against the side of a block can just stay in one object and be named center. The wiki page goes into this a little bit. It's might be more explanatory than what I just tried to say. Basically, you can have 7 shapes, a center, like I just named the main part of our pyramid, and then another object that would be against any of the 6 sides of a cube. So I just split this apart into 2, our bottom, our center, and we're basically ready to export this and check it out in Terasology. Before we do that though, we need to do one last thing to be able to let it export successfully, and that's UV unwrap it so that Terasology knows how to apply textures to it. I'm not going to go into anything about that really in this video tutorial. If you're not familiar with 3D editing like this at all, then UV editing is something that can be kind of tricky and such, so I'm not going to try and cover it at all in this basic tutorial. I'm just going to say that you need to go into edit mode, select everything, and hit U and unwrap. That will unwrap everything. Do that with both objects and just unwrap that. So that will allow Terasology to apply textures to it, and it might not look great because we're just using Blender's default unwrapping, but it'll at least work. Oops. Okay. With that finished, and our two things named correctly, separated correctly, and again, UV unwrapped, then we're ready to export this. So we're just going to select it, hit File, Export, Terasology block shape. And that will go right into, let's see, right here. And I already had a test pyramid in here, so I'm just going to override it, and override it, and you don't need to worry about that. There we go. If you hit the export and as long as some sort of like black air box that pops up by your mouse doesn't show up, then it should have exported just fine. I'm going to just minimize that, get rid of that. Okay. So here we go. Here's the pyramid shape we just made. I am going to just drop it into Terasology right now and see what it looks like. Now there's several different ways you could get a block shape into Terasology. I'm just going to use the very most basic one, which will be very familiar to anyone who's ever modded like Minecraft or something, which is just open up the .jar, the Terasology.jar with something like 7-zip. Open the archive, and there's this handy folder right here at the top, Assets, which we can go into, and there's a Shape folder. Again, we can go into that, and this is all of the default shapes that come in the base game of Terasology. These come base game and aren't added by any mods or anything. These are just the base shapes. So we can just drop, let's put that back. Let's see. We can just drop our pyramid shape right into this. Select yes, and there we go. It's basically installed. We should be able to open Terasology right now and check it out. Let's open Terasology and inspect it. I am going to just create a new world real fast to test this. Let's see. Mods. Okay. Should just take a second. And we started underwater. Well, let's see. I'm just going to pop up here, and you know what? I just realized I did not cover the most important thing almost, which is the two panes that Terasology block shape add-on adds in Blender. I forgot to mention this, that Terasology adds these two panes. Now luckily in our case it doesn't really matter at all that I didn't mention these. I'll cover this stuff in more detail. The only thing you might want to take a look at is, if you really want to, you could fill in the author field, and otherwise the only thing I would have changed is, instead of full cube, which is pretty self-explanatory for collision type, so right now in Terasology, when I go back, our pyramid's going to act like a full block, so I'll be able to like stand on top of it and stuff, which is sort of unrealistic, obviously. So the only thing I would have changed would have been auto convex hull. This basically just shrink wraps the collision shape around this, so it would act more like a actual pyramid instead of a cube. So I forgot to mention that. I'll be covering those in more detail later, though. Last thing I just want to mention, now that I'm thinking about it, is that this isn't a problem if you model off of the default cube in Blender, but if you move stuff around, the center of your objects, or that little orange dot that has the axis things around it, that's the center of each object, that actually has to be at the origin of this world. So at the intersection of these colored lines, the axis lines, those have to be at the origin. Now, as I said, that's not a problem if you're just modeling off the default cube, but otherwise you can. So you can, in the tool pane over here, there's the origin, and you can set that to origin to 3D cursor, for instance, which you can set to the center of the world by hitting Shift C. The 3D cursor, as I mentioned, is that little striped circle in the view there. That's not a problem. Didn't really have to go into that in this video, though. So yeah. Okay. Back to Terasology. As I said, since I forgot to mention the Terasology settings, our pyramid is going to act like a cube, but that's not too much of a problem. Okay, here we are. Looks like a good spot to test out. You have to get block shapes to the console in Terasology, so we're just going to first check list shapes that are block shape was indeed loaded. And yes, there it is, pyramid. Good, we can just give block some of them to ourselves. Let's see, just gonna get some stone pyramids. There we go. Okay, it's kind of hidden there. Oh, there we go. So you receive 16 blocks of stone, so that should be in our pyramid shape. Looks like it. Yes, there we go. Look at that. Very simple block shape, but it shows the process very well. Make like a spike pit with this. As I said, they're cubes, so I'm sort of just walking around on top of them, but shows the process. That's basically the workflow for creating block shapes in Blender. I'll be doing other tutorials in the future on like good tips to speed up and improve modeling block shapes and such, and how to do better UV unwrapping, although this doesn't look too bad and such. But I'll be doing more video tutorials in the future and cover a lot of those things. So yeah, but this was our basic block shape, and should have given you an idea of the process, and hopefully you can start making some cool block shapes. See ya.